Welcome, welcome. Dr. Rhian Crane here of Semantrics, a relatively new platform which I run with Rosalind Stone, who's a psychedelic media consultant. What we're basically interested in is the relationship between language, perception, and culture. So thanks for the flicker of curiosity that may have carried you here to our conversation with Mareesa Stertz, who is a storyteller and a filmmaker, among other things. Now, we're doing something a little bit different today with this conversation in that we're going to release it into the wild. So regular Semantrics folks, please excuse my loose attempt at being affable and conventional for the next few minutes. The reason for that is because Mareesa is basically the closest thing we've found to a sort of psychedelic rhetorical ally, in that we essentially share the same rationale and the same concerns around collective understandings of narrative. Of course, the psychedelic wellness industry is rapidly increasing in momentum and increased accessibility to these extraordinary compounds that I think really can help us to shift perspectives or reframe our traumas or disrupt our thought patterns. And yet, the patterns and the rhythms and the education of Western culture, at least mainstream Western culture, really don't cultivate the tools and practices for this. Most people just have no idea how much their language influences their perception and their emotions, their identity. As much as I wish you could, you can't just repeat positive affirmations and expect your story or your belief system to radically change. You know, if that were the case, I think it's very unlikely that we'd have multimillionaire life coaches. You know, that's a symptom of the fact that most people don't have the access codes to edit their own stories. Introduce psychedelics into that environment and it can all become very incoherent very quickly, you know, especially alongside this whole woke movement, which I think in most cases just adds another layer of, you know, polarization and misdirection and exclusive language and virtue signaling, you know. But just having some understanding of what language is at its foundations gives us so much more agency over our experience. You know, the easier it becomes to make meaning out of any experience, whether it's extraordinary or not. You know, the easier it becomes to spot misinformation or see through conflicts, or even just to play with your own consciousness, you know. And that's what we're interested in here, these semantic foundations that are everywhere and invisible to most of us most of the time. Just to mention, we do have a live online course that runs throughout the year on language and perception, and we look at metaphors and media and translation, many other things. It's 8 weeks long and we have groups that run throughout the year. There's some locomotion for the next 2 months, so the next group's going to be in June, around the 20th. What we do is we find out everybody's availability and schedule the sessions accordingly, even make smaller groups if necessary. But there's more info on that on our website, semantrics.co.uk, where you can also register your interest and we'll get in touch. So if the Semantrics course focuses on the cultural architecture of cognition and perception, then Mareesa's will be something like a renovation or a refurbishing of some of those internal narrative structures, that housing. You know, it's about clearing out narratives that don't serve you anymore. It's also a live online course. I believe the next one starts on April 23rd. You can read more about that on her website, yourstoryiseverything.com, which is such a good title, and we couldn't agree more. You know, many of the stories that we're inundated by are just really toxic, you know, like an old rotten carpet where every time you're in that part of the house, you're just like inhaling filth from years ago and you don't even notice because you can't see it and you're just used to it. Just as a side note, Ros and I are based in Mexico, and I've been really enjoying telling North Americans and Mexicans this last week about bathroom carpets in the UK. They've been like, oh, like a tile with a kind of fabric finish. Oh no, not like that at all. But anyways, we really enjoyed this conversation with Mareesa, who just speaks really honestly and unpretentiously about vulnerability and the basic challenges of being human. And she's someone who just refreshingly doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but rather has a method of narrative inquiry and a series of stories that I think a lot of people will find sincerely useful. Mareesa is a storyteller, filmmaker, and communicator in a range of different realms. She's one of the co-founders of Lucid News and producer and host of the documentary series The Healing Powers of Psychedelics and Other Mindful Practices, and also the documentary film Damanhur, both of which you can find on Gaia TV. I actually got the free trial of Damanhur just to... No, I got the free trial of Gaia to watch Damanhur. Very much worth it. And she runs storytelling workshops online and also on the usual festival and retreat rounds. I mentioned her course starts on April 23rd. Lamentably, we didn't get to talk about auspicious numbers in 23, but we were quite well behaved in this session, so hopefully she'll talk to us again. If you enjoy this conversation, then please feel free to make some random act of kindness, however small, however stupid, with anyone who crosses your path. And if you feel moved to tell us about it, then we would genuinely love to hear about it. We are on all the usual social media channels. Yeah, you'll find us there. I can't, in good faith, recommend that you spend more time on there, but we are actively doing things in those places should you want to engage with that. Do whatever you want.
The course that you're offering sounds super fascinating.
Finish my PhD, I wanted to be able to make it more accessible.
It felt like a very natural marriage of what Rianne's been doing in her academic studies and then me noticing all of these stale metaphors and kind of stagnant ways of describing things in the work that I do, and just thinking, let's like blow this up together and invite.
I would say I'm also, really fascinated about how language and how our thoughts create our reality. And this came from a sort of, I had to figure it out myself. I had a lot of trauma in childhood, and the family and my family also, they did an amazing job in so many ways. And, it was like, life's hard sometimes, and chin up, move forward, don't cry over spilled milk, don't be a victim, just move on. And, I did my best at moving on and not really spending any time unpacking the past. And that's, I've sort of limped along with a lot of failure to thrive all the way until I was somewhere in my mid 30s, and I was just having one, like, life was one crash, one abyss, one difficult moment after another, and I really just couldn't get my head above water. I was perpetually broke, without much community and all these things, and without much support, and everything career was failing. And so I started to get really serious about healing and starting to understand why this was happening, and creating what I like to think of as a map to make sense of why life wasn't making sense. And in creating that map, so much of the focus came around, like, what is the language? How are we thinking about what is the language of our thoughts? How are we thinking about our thoughts? And how are we creating? So that's how I got started.
Was therapy already in your vocabulary? Because you describe a kind of stiff upper lip vibe almost in your family.
I remember being in college, like 18, 19, and being like, I think I need therapy. And I would try to get it. I'd never had the money to afford it. First of all, that was the first barrier. So it just felt very unaffordable, and then there were, of course, people that were offering it on sliding scale. And I attempted to connect with them. And it was like really bad dating. You'd meet someone and you'd tell them about what was going on, and you could see them going into their internal dictionary of diagnoses and try to give you a label. And I didn't feel understood or well met. And I was like, I think I'm teaching you stuff about emotional intelligence, even though you're technically the expert. And so it was just so frustrating that I backed away and wasn't able to dive into it. I tried a couple of times, and now I think I might have the network to actually find a really good therapist.
Down the line, did it turn out that was a clash between kind of the Western clinical conceptualizations of a lot of these things, and as you kind of learned more about like plant medicines and other ways to think about what was going on, did you start to find stuff that resonated a lot more to grapple with in the way that people talked about problems?
I would say so, for sure. I don't think I understood what was going on. I didn't have any comprehension at the time. But the fact was that they were very oriented towards diagnoses and putting me in a box, and then, okay, you fit in this box, therefore these are the things to say, these are the things to give you, and like this is the way we treat that. And didn't feel very human. I didn't feel seen or understood. And then the solutions that were offered were rarely actually of a service. I felt more frustrated just that I wasn't understood, like just in the efforts of getting them to understand, than any benefit of what they told me afterwards.
Did you ever go down the pharmaceuticals route?
Not really. I think I had enough, I've struggled throughout my life with this condition called dermatillomania, which is skin picking, where you're like, ooh, there's something here, let me pick at it. But then I would get really carried away and like pretty much destroy my entire face trying to clear every single pore of any potential blemish. And a doctor wanted to give me Prozac for that. And with that, I already was like, wait a minute, that it didn't fit what I felt I had at the time. I already became skeptical then. And then, weird experiences with birth control that just threw my emotions into a turmoil at like 18 or 19. I was already like, nah, these are bad. I don't have any desire for this whatsoever.
Definitely share that skin picking.
And I share the birth control misgivings very wholeheartedly.
So common, right? So it's like our whole system is like misdiagnosing us and giving us bad things, and we're figuring it out as we go along.
I think it was from the doctor that was prescribing me birth control, actually, that I learned about financial incentivization. And he was telling me as he was giving me the coil that he would get more for doing that than for if he were to give 10 women birth control pills, he'd only be giving out a year of contraception in the whole day. Whereas if he gets 10 women with 10 coils, then that's 100 years of contraception given out that day. And he was kind of delightedly explaining this while giving me this really unsuitable, like really painful thing that had to come out about 6 months later.
Psychotic.
So yeah, that definitely felt like a really important twinning kind of the financials of these things. And then I guess that's something that's like very different when you start discovering the plant medicines. There's obviously not that economy in that way. How did the medicines that ultimately helped you come into your life?
I was so eager to get out of my head. And I grew up in Las Vegas that they came into my life pretty early. I was 14 or 15 when I first did mushrooms. Definitely 14 when I was already smoking cannabis. And, and I'd done LSD and MDMA by the time I was 18. And I'd had actually some really transformative experiences, maybe like somewhere around 3 to 5, but I'd also had a lot of experiences where it aggravated my system and really like magnified the anxiety and the self-loathing and the pain that I carried in my system. And I didn't know how to work with them in a good way. I knew there was magic because I'd had some wild epiphanies, but because I didn't know how to work with them and they were more often going into a negative, difficult place, that I was like, I'm going to just take a step back here. You guys are kind of expensive. Drugs are kind of expensive, and I'm not really sure if it's worth the pain. So I'll just drink instead. And drinking was my chosen way to get out of my head. And that, again, served me until I burnt myself out and exhausted myself. I was never wasn't really what I would call a problem drinker, but it was also not great for me. And I just exhausted myself overworking and other unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so at one point I was like, this is really bad now. I think I need to step away. And it was at that moment that one of my many rock bottoms in my early 30s, that I encountered people using psychedelics intentionally. And so I heard that people were gathering, and there was a shaman from Peru who was giving them different kinds of medicines. He was a chemist. So it wasn't just ayahuasca or mushrooms. It was also sassafras and mistletoe and kanna and all these different things I wasn't familiar with. And he was offering them to people for whatever was suitable for what they were working on. And people would, set the intention, and the lights would dim and nice music would play, and we would journey. And that would go throughout the night. And I started to slowly unpack, and I was surrounded. A lot of the people attending these were therapists and healers, or walking the path of shamanism themselves. And so from them in that container, I started to understand, all the times I've had like stress and adrenaline and cortisol in my system, or anger or fear, and I shoved it down and pretended it wasn't happening, all of that was just creating emotional constipation in my system, basically just blocking up my life force energy, and that the medicines were actually helping me unlock it. And so I started to get much more serious about the path, and it took me to Peru and all sorts of adventures, making documentaries around it, and co-founding news platforms and throwing small conferences.
From the offset, you had a community then. You were doing this.
More or less. It was very awkward. The first time I went, I was like, there was a cuddle puddle, and it was a lot of older people too, which was really cool. But there were cuddle puddles, and I was just like, wow, it was very like, it was a good held container. It was clean, there wasn't weird energies around. And I was just like blown away by that people connected, holding each other with love and compassion. And it was, and in support of healing. And I also was so much full of my own self-loathing, that it wasn't an easy fit for me to suddenly fall into it. I was awkward. I hated the world. I hated myself. After half an hour of this really beautiful MDMA-like experience, I suddenly got a headache and was grinding my jaw, and the rest of the night was really hard. It took me a year before I mustered the money to come back, and also the nerve. And, then when I came back a year later, I kind of made a friend. And, it was painful and awkward, but, I kind of kept coming back, and eventually I started making more friends. And then it did turn into a community that's, that I still am in touch with.
What went on for you during that first year? Did you periodically have kind of small realizations of, oh, actually that part of the experience was helpful, and kind of keep coming back to that first not particularly pleasant experience and reappraising it until it led you back again?
I don't think I was able to reappraise that experience until years down the road. I was really like, that drug was bad for me and they shouldn't have given it to me. Like I didn't understand why it wasn't working. I was really frustrated. It wasn't that I actually thought that it had done something for me. It was more that, I was still really hungry for healing, and that container was the closest thing I had ever come to it. And so even though like consciously, I don't think I was like, I know I was hearing stories about ayahuasca. I was hearing stories about things. So I knew there was healing in it. And I figured I would try something different. But I definitely felt like I was a detective. And it was like a few years into it where I had been a filmmaker who had directed a lot of music videos and short films, but I didn't really know how to shoot. I didn't know how to operate the video camera until my mom gave me a DSLR that it was, a still camera that allows you to shoot video as well. And it was in the same point of time that I was working with the psychedelics that I started to get these little openings to start shooting video. And the two of them, it was almost as I was working with psychedelics, more doors were opening for me to learn how to shoot and to start shooting and to start getting work. So that whole failure to thrive and struggle thing that I was going through started to lessen, and I started to get more opportunities. And as I was suddenly shooting documentaries and having these breakthroughs on my own, I was like, oh my God, the world needs to know. And so it felt very much like I was in the Wild West, shooting and documenting my own story, capturing my own healing and what it was like to work with this trauma and how trauma operates. And so I started filming a documentary about my own process. And then that was also what launched the series for Gaia TV. Which is the healing powers of psychedelics and other mindful practices, kind of like a host that travels around the world and shows, hey, this is what it's like to work with San Pedro or Ayahuasca or cannabis in a therapeutic way.
Is that how you got into your own process of storytelling then, like through filmmaking, or were you a literary child?
I was never a writer. Ironic, since I have a news platform, a co-founder of a news platform. I was always really into, I wanted to tell stories. I remember sitting around the dinner table and being like, I want to tell a story to my parents. My dad was too stressed out to listen. And so I'd get shut down and I'd be so frustrated. And this part of me just loved to like, I want to share and be in front of people and illustrate. And so I was really wanting to do theater, but I was super, super shy. So I had this very like opposite conflict internally. And it wasn't, yeah, so I went through theater in high school. I started directing plays there. It just never felt very practical. And so I wasn't taking it that serious until I went to college, and I lost all desire to do. I was trying to do something serious and get business and have a normal job that made sense, and I lost all desire to do that. I couldn't connect to it. I didn't care. And out of the blue, I had an epiphany of like, you will make films. And I was like, well, films are kind of like theater, but you can make money with it. So let's do that. And so that was what got me going. And then so I studied film in college in San Francisco, and made films for what, throughout my 20s, and never made any money, never figured it out until the documentaries. And then that piece, it started to really come together.
Beautiful. I was the same. I really wanted to do sort of theatre things, but I had this crippling stammer, so I couldn't speak, which is really frustrating.
I feel you. I was so shy. I would start sentences and drift them off halfway through. I can only imagine, yeah, it's when it's an actual speech thing, that's, yeah, difficult stuff.
To have that juxtaposition, because I didn't have a stammer, but I was also so painfully shy that what actually happened if I tried to do any acting was very different to how it had been going to be in my head. So it was this thing of having this really rich internal world, and then paradoxically not being able to kind of render that accurately in this one. And I can imagine that with film, there's a lot more control and artistry which you can put in order to make what's in your head come out in these different ways, which must feel really satisfying.
It's extraordinarily satisfying. It's now, so I'm teaching classes on how your story is everything. That's the whole yourstoryis-everything.com. I mean, my story was that as a child, that I'm not interesting, that nobody wants to hear what I have to say. Maybe I'm just one of those people who shouldn't talk. And that was, what I would tell myself when I would feel rejected left and right. And I would try to be okay with it. And then internally in the shower, I'd be making like shampoo commercials, and I'd pretend, and I would, whenever I could, I would be theatrical. And to then encounter all these obstacles, my theater teacher was like, you should never sing. I was just shut down left and right in so many ways, and with the trauma and the social anxiety. But now I have so much gratitude. I think it was those obstacles that I encountered over and over that not only helped me develop the strength and persistence to, continue to work, because getting out there is a lot of work, right? It doesn't happen easily. There's so much persistence you have to do. So I got to practice that a lot in childhood, but also I really honor now the trauma and the obstacles I encountered, because that's what I'm talking about. Like, it is the literal content that I share when I am publicly speaking. It is because of this. And so when I earlier talked about having a map for healing, it is a map that is based off of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. I've sort of created a distilled down version called the human journey, where it is really honoring every obstacle we encounter is there to help us grow. I think if life were perfect, you'd be floating along like this. But when you encounter an obstacle, you're going to hit it over and over and over again until if you can't get over it, then it's going to force you inwards, where you have to reach deep down inside to find your strength and your power, so that you can then be a better version of yourself and overcome that obstacle and move on.
I think if you're not praised and you're sort of not told that you're brilliant, then but you still want to do it, and you're still doing it, then it's like you're doing it for a reason. You're doing it because you genuinely feel compelled to do this, and it's not for the applause
and maybe you don't know why, but then it's that journey to like work out why, and things will click into place years later, and it'll be like, oh, that's why I was so determined to get that out into the world.
It's just, I mean, I think if my parents and all the adults around me were really interested in what I had to say all the time as a 4-year-old, I think I'd be insufferable now.
Yeah, interesting point. I don't, I really wonder, or yeah, who knows? It's really interesting. Who would we be if we were actually encouraged the whole time? But there was a really cool study where these parents, they monitored parents that were very over loving of their children. They never let them cry it out. They were always really attentive all the way through. And they then compared them with parents who believed that you not let your child cry it out, that you let your child self-soothe. They weren't able to be as loving and as attentive to the child's emotional needs per se. And they compared these children and their well-being growing up. And I think when they looked at them at the age of 40, the children who had been loved and like almost overly loved had the best sense of self-confidence, self-worth. They were more successful. And the ones who had been left to cry it out had a sense of like needing and unfulfillment and were in a lot more unhealthy patterns emotionally. And I wonder, I really think it's interesting question to ask ourselves. If we were truly given all the things we need, where would we be now? However, like I said, I'm so grateful to have encountered those obstacles because they give me something to share about that feels very meaningful. And I'm really honored that like the stories I'm sharing, often people will come to me afterwards and be like, wow, thank you. That just helped me see it in a totally different light. And I'm able to shift my perspective, and that brings me great joy. So like I said, I would sign up for all that trauma all over again because I learned a lot. But it's easy to say that when you're on the other side. When you're still suffering, and not so much.
I think it's cultural as well. You see a lot of like warmth and tactility in Mexican cultures, but even in our generation, in British culture, it's not affectionate.
Yeah, hugging is much more kind of something you do as a social etiquette thing at particular times rather than something that just happens in a lot of British culture, I feel like. I'm wondering about when people take your course, whether there's quite a lot of variation between how easy people find it to identify their personal hurdles and their kind of original traumas compared to one another. Because I guess there's a sense in which it can be difficult to acknowledge that unless you had any of the kind of token things that make a terrible childhood, I feel like sometimes people can be quite loath to say that was terrible, that really affected me badly, that's my terrible thing, because if they've had a loving upbringing wrapping around that, then it seems really can feel ungrateful to identify any of it as the terrible thing that needs to be acknowledged in order to progress. So yeah, I'm wondering about how you help people find their thing and overcome that sense of maybe not being prepared to acknowledge it.
I mean, the problem is real for sure. I've found that that this really works well for people, I think like 27 and above. I think when you're younger, you're still forming. And what I have found helpful is to make the distinction of what is big T trauma and little T trauma. And big T trauma is what you would typically say, those big accidents, big traumas, violence, sexual assault, witnessing, war, or being in natural disasters. Those are clearly big traumas, but there's a lot of trauma that are little T traumas of, not being seen at home, walking on eggshells your childhood. If a parent was depressed or had an illness, and they were not available, there creates a whole set of like maybe all kinds of things that can come up. So really bringing those into awareness. And what I've kind of got like these formulas and these structures of like, what is your biggest struggle right now? Let's go back and create a timeline and look back at all the times similar dynamics have occurred. Can we better understand what those dynamics are? Let's shift our perspective to it and look around and see how does it show up. And so through these sort of lens shifts and these different tools and these different frames, typically you're able to bring that up. But it really depends on where the person is in their own growth. And there is no rushing this. I'm often frustrated by the sense of the course has 6 sessions over the course of 2 months. We're going to change that soon. But it's a little frustrating because I feel like the soul has its own speed. You're gonna grow and evolve at whatever's appropriate for you. And what does happen is people will hit a wall, and there's this internal resistance that comes up, and they're like, I don't know how to I'm just busy. I can't seem to find the time, can't seem to work on it. And I'm like, okay, you're at the place where your soul needs to be right now. You got some pieces that we loosened up, and now you can allow that to marinate. And at some point it will be ready to shift. But for now, you can be aware of whatever you're ready to be aware of.
And is that all coming up kind of self-protectively because it's not time to kind of open the floodgates fully and do the necessary breaking down that would come with going on with the work at that time, do you reckon?
I think so. I remember reading books when I was 20 that I was like, this is so wise. This is amazing. This sounds true. And I have no idea what to do with it. I'm gonna I can't put any of it into action because it's not time. And it took me, and then 10 years later, I'd pick up the same book and I'd be like, oh yeah, this is totally I've incorporated this now. It's no longer, I understand this in theory, but I actually understand this in practice. And I don't know, there's this oh no, the world's falling apart. We better hurry and heal and get ourselves together. And I don't want to subscribe to that. I'm like, that's scarcity mind frame, right? What if we just trust that we are all growing at the right speed that we need to? Don't force it. I think that's part of the old colonialist mind frame. Competition, we have to hurry up, we better do it or else we're going to all explode. Yeah, more like, no, let's honor the pace that we're moving at and see and trust that it's all happening exactly the way it should.
I was just imagining, if you had and some people do have upbringings without trauma or without what other people would class as trauma, you could still feel like your life had no meaning, right? You could still feel the sort of indifference, even though you didn't really have a trigger. But then for some people, breaking up with their boyfriend when they were 16 was the trauma that has made them unable to open up emotionally, really, really these sort of normal things.
Like a sense of relativity. So that will have to be the ink drop that dyes the rest of the container the color of the ink if there's not a bigger ink drop.
Yeah, I'm struggling to language it in a way that's not like a hierarchy of trauma. It's really difficult.
Well,
I don't mean
and
that.
I think there's a lot of people that are like, I didn't have big trauma, and is my life, does that mean I don't have a story, or does that mean I'm, is there something wrong with me? There's actually FOMO of not having trauma. That's the thing. And I also, I don't know, I think that, to our point earlier with the study, when you don't have that trauma and you don't have these obstacles of having to figure out your self-worth and your meaning in yourself, I think you're free to do other things, and you're free to maybe find excellence in certain ways. And maybe your life isn't about overcoming massive obstacles, but it is about stepping into beautiful excellence. And I also think, though, that we each there's other studies of how trauma is passed down genetically. And they did one with these rats and this cherry blossom fragrance, where they had rats in a cage, and they first give them a shock and then they blast them with the fragrance. And they do this over and over again. And of course, the rats are getting a little PTSD whenever they smell the fragrance. And then those rats have babies that are never given the shock and are never given the blast of fragrance. And those babies have babies. So the grandbabies of the rats are given no shock, just the blast of cherry blossom fragrance, and they have signs of PTSD. And so, it's just like the conditions that showed these rats they needed to protect themselves are passed down. And what I like to think of is, when we're protecting ourselves, that constriction, that blocking, right, that tightening, we're bracing and hardening ourselves. That is the opposite of having access to life force energy.
I wonder if also that's maybe can be habituated, because I remember you were talking about that Julie Holland project where she was giving therapy for PTSD to, I think, victims of racial trauma.
Yeah, no, it was a documentary on Xanax, and it was a woman of color who was trying to get men of color to come for therapy, and then she'd be with people and they'd say they had no trauma, and then this guy was like, well, that's a little while after I got shot. It's like, you got shot? Like, why didn't you tell me? I asked you if you had any trauma. Like, oh, loads of people get shot.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. If you're just in a bed of if everyone who you're surrounded with has also had those experiences and isn't like symptomatically aggressively attacked by PTSD or CP, complex PTSD, then yeah, people don't think they have trauma. Or if it's just passed down ancestrally, it might not be apparent. You might not be able to look at it directly, but it's something, that shows up in hypnosis from a past life. So, I really think that the human condition is very mysterious. And where does our depth come from when we look at our whole lives and are like, oh, everything's been great. You might be carrying something left over from a past life. Who knows?
And do you give people some of the tools or the kind of seeds to go off and look beyond what they might be bringing in their own narrative to find kind of the seeds of trauma elsewhere as part of the beginning, and then take them through a process of working out how to tell their story from the point of this? Is that the kind of structure of the 6 weeks at the moment?
And well put. There's two ways I've been teaching this course. One is for people who want to simply understand how to tell their story. And then the other, which is actually the next round, and the first time I'll be launching the full length of this, is psychedelics in the story, which is exactly what you said, where it's like the tools to help you better understand this. The whole system is designed basically to use this tool of storytelling, identifying what your old stories are, investigating where they come from, and
that was
then
really difficult in your demo. That was really difficult. You asked a question like, what are the phrases that repeat themselves, and it's really hard to know for yourself.
Right. Yeah. And, this is why you don't come in. That's one way to come into it, but there's a million ways. So if you want to say, for example, if somebody, if your listeners want to give this a go, I invite people to take the top 3 struggles that is alive for them at this moment. So it could be abundance and scarcity, for example. If money is an issue, you can make that list 1. Finding your life purpose, list 2. A meaningful, rich relationship or partnership, make that list 3. And let's say you wanted to better understand one of those. So then if we say relationship, for example, I really struggled with them a lot throughout my life. Every romantic relationship I had a pattern, which was I was really attracted to emotionally unavailable men. And I would like lean into them, and I would try to make things happen. And I was always chasing them, and I was always thinking about them, and it was really unhealthy and really unfulfilling. And they would always get overwhelmed by all my expectation. It was very codependent, basically. And I didn't understand that codependence wasn't good. I didn't even understand what that meant for a very long time. And it was I wish I could say it was the process of storytelling that helped me understand it. It has retroactively given me insight. But when I put all my relationship history on a timeline, and I realized that literally every meaningful relationship carried this dynamic of me chasing for somebody's attention. And when I take it all the way back to childhood, that was the relationship with me and my father. He loved us. He did everything he could. He was such a good supporting father in so many ways, but he had a terrible temper, and he was emotionally unavailable. He had no patience for kids. And so I remember really wanting his attention, and he couldn't do it. He just didn't have it for himself. So how could he have it for children? And look at how that dynamic has basically, what I had to learn is, until I am able to give myself the attention I need, until I'm able to reparent myself and father myself, I will be stuck chasing after other people who are just replicating that old dynamic from childhood. And so it is really hard when it's a direct question of like, what are the dynamics of your trauma? What are the statements that you're thinking of yourself that you're not aware of? But when you start to like map it out in these ways, it starts to become more present. And then when it comes to like utilizing it with psychedelics, what happens when you completely familiarize your mind with those dynamics, with those old memories, with the things you wish you had said, or the things you did say and you wish you could take back, whatever it is, if you bring that all up into your mind, I even recommend like record a voice memo. Say all the things you wish you could say to them. Say it emotionally, feel it. And then depending on your level of psychedelic expertise, if you are If you have a good sitter and you're new, this is something you can do with their support. If you are experienced on your own, you can also do this by yourself. Maybe have a friend in a room nearby that they can help you in case you get into a rough space emotionally. Please, anyone listening to this who wants to try it, do lots of research before you embark on your first solo journey. And by what I've found over and over again is whatever I prime my conscious mind with ahead of a journey, that is what my journey orients itself according to. And I am able to give myself insights and see even further parts of it that I couldn't see in my normal sober state of mind.
That's remarkable control.
The way you present it really encouragingly, it feels so like a formula or a recipe that it feels really like practical advice that you can follow, even though, of course, the controllers to be able to do that is really remarkable. I agree.
I mean, there's two other people I want to cite as really good references, because this is a tool that works sober as well. Carolyn Elliott's book, Existential Kink.
I love that book.
It's amazing, right? And Tara Brach, Radical Acceptance. Both of these are very similar techniques. The idea is the mind resists. What we resist will persist. Mm-hmm. And so if we can just allow ourselves to feel all the feelings as much as we can, all the pain, stop trying to fight it and numb it and change the channel. No. If you feel bad and your heart hurts, feel the hurt. Get out of the story, but feel the feelings in your physical body. And by being present with them and allowing yourself to have them, they burn themselves out. Or if there's some understanding that needs to come through, it will come through. You just do it as long as your body is calling for that attention.
I was going to ask you a question about the body, because before you said a couple of really brilliant phrases, hungry for healing and emotionally constipated, and then something else about incorporating knowledge later on. So a lot of kind of bodily imagery. And so I was just wondering about like the body within the course as a whole, like how often do you direct people to kind of somatic elements of what's going on? And obviously, because existential kink has a very somatic component as well. So yeah, I'm just curious about the body in relation to the mind in your work.
I call this the course Your Story is Everything, but honestly, like your body is everything too. And I really think the two are so important. When I'm working with psychedelics, when I was early on my own path, I really wanted to have these big epiphanies and breakthroughs and visual hallucinations and ancestors visiting me. And what instead I got was journey after journey of me curled up in a ball, feeling like shit. And just like, the medicine's not working for me. I'm not getting any breakthroughs. But what I've seen now, to reference back to the emotional constipation, is all those times I shoved my feelings down, all those times I shut myself off from my own authentic expression, and every time I denied myself, that just got stuck in my system, almost like a heavy plaque. And that by my being with myself in a medicine state, or if I'm practicing something like existential kink or radical acceptance, by being with the difficult feelings, I am slowly unlocking them and loosening that plaque out of my system so that I can again reconnect to that life force energy and create space for that energy to move through me. And so I don't think we can write a new story until we fully witnessed our old stories and fully felt the feelings of our old pain. And yeah, so I direct a lot of attention to the somatic element. I don't think it works otherwise.
It's great. I mean, just the whole thing, everything you're doing is great. This tremendous ubiquitous narrative about psychedelics and reframing your life, as this sort of slogans almost. And I think people just don't know how to do that. People have no idea what stories mean for their actual experience, and no idea how language works, and how we're embodying and living these metaphors. And
I think there can be such a false expectation that the psychedelic experience is going to be some kind of codification of what's already known. And what you're talking about here, it seems much more the case that you have this experience where your perspective of where you stand within your story shifts, and then that means that the calcified bits of story get to fall away, but only when you've kind of changed where you're looking at the whole thing from. So it's not just like an extra lens on top of the lenses you already have, but like a whole movement of the diorama to a different position, which feels like I can imagine people go on grappling with this stuff for a lot longer than 6 weeks and then come back to you endlessly down the line. Do you have kind of ongoing follow-up conversations with a lot of the people?
I definitely, there's quite a few return people where they're like, okay, I was able to come through the first half of the course and now I feel like I'm really ready to actually finish it. Can I come back? And then we do like, yeah, come back, please. And it's been extraordinary to see what happens through those, I don't know, 6-month break in between sessions. There's so much that moves. It's really, you're right. Like it's a shifting of where we are in relation to it. And I mean, you know, it requires that big overhaul. Society teaches us, oh, there's something wrong. Well, here's a Band-Aid and here's a solution. But in fact, there's nothing wrong. It's just, here's an obstacle that you get to dance with and learn from and get to better know. And this is a teacher. And when you accept it and are present with it, it will allow you to expand and grow and become a better version of yourself through having danced with it. Even if it's just, I like to also say, you know, sometimes the worst things in the world happen, like they can be very, very horrible. And it's like, why did that happen? Why did that need to happen? And we can spend a lot of time and energy in that, why did it need to happen? But on the other side of the why did it need to happen is the, wow, I am strong enough to have survived this and I have built resilience. And down the road later on, that strength and resilience is fuel for really powerful expansion. So just highlighting that is an outcome that I've seen come out over and over again.
And is the fact that it's a group an important aspect as well? I'm just thinking about, you know, relationship history, and then, you know, knowing it's from your father, but knowing that doesn't necessarily mean that you stop doing it. But maybe, you know, if other people can see that behavior as well, and you're
I mean, the group container is extraordinarily cathartic. Like, just it gives people permission. Like when one person shares something that brought them a lot of shame or difficulty, when they share that empowers others to look as deeply inside themselves. It's not quite, you know, because it's because the work is so intense, there's not really an opportunity for people to catch each other on when they're able to implement it or not.
yeah.
I wish there were. That would be fun, but that could also be complicated, so maybe not. I don't know.
That's what friends are for, in theory.
Exactly. Friends and family, right? Yeah.
I definitely have that, where I become aware of a pattern, then I think, oh, it's me reacting in this way, and I don't manage not to have the reaction, but there's this awareness that I'm doing it, so at least it's meta.
Yeah. I think that's better than being completely bewildered and like alienated by your own behavior.
And slowly with time, it just builds and builds, and we go from noticing it and suppressing it to holding it gently, you know, in that process of like reparenting and loving ourselves as we have this unhealthy behavior that is dysfunctional. You know, you start to have compassion for it and you start to like accept it, and then it can start to, that is the process that where it changes. So yeah.
You mentioned right at the beginning, you were talking about hating yourself. Did you know that you hated yourself?
Kind of, you know, and I also thought I loved myself at the same time. I think I which was the contradiction I think I felt in childhood. So, you know, I was just like angry at the world. I was angry at everything. I remember being like, God, you're so stupid, you know, and I'd be talking to myself. I didn't realize that wasn't cool because everybody around me was kind of angry in that same way. So, you know, I would have been like, oh, I love myself. What are you talking about?
Yeah. You love yourself because you bought that nice cushion the other day that like.
Exactly. I give myself a day off or whatever. Yeah, I bought those really nice, expensive jeans.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Nicole LaPera, the holistic psychologist? She uses reparenting a lot as well. And I was wondering how you calibrate that in terms of any guilt people might feel about the idea of kind of reparenting when they, by and large, love their parents, but there are various obviously things to reparent, that like I was wondering if that kind of the qualification of that as a phrase ever comes up, that like you can reparent without like needing to kind of totally reject the parents that you come from.
I love Nicole LaPera's work. I'm constantly referencing her stuff. Her
I do
Instagram
as well.
posts are right. There's her Instagram posts are amazing. The holistic psychologist. Yeah. So I haven't, I mean, I think I try to represent it whenever I talk about my own parents who, like I said, they sacrificed, they did so much good work in parenting, and they just had their own blind spots, and I just remind people, it's like, we can't see our own blind spots, and we do the best we can with what we have. Our parents didn't have the resources or the time, or it wasn't normal to talk about and think about things the way we are talking and thinking about now. Like mental health was not in anyone's field of awareness, really, it feels like.
And definitely no parity with physical health.
Right. Yeah. So, I don't think we can blame, and blame isn't a healthy way to go anyway. So, but, just having compassion for where our parents were at and what they did.